Chapter 4, Brooke. I channeled every bit of bravery I had as he stitched up my arm and wrapped it back up with gauze. Unlike his ruined shirt, the gauze was barely soaking up new blood. He had done it. He had really sewed up my arm. I had done it. I had really survived it without pain medicine. The old man let go of my hand. I didn't remember him grabbing it or if I grabbed him in all the excitement. "I'm going back to bed," the man said to me. He patted my good arm. "I'm glad you're okay. Be careful out there." I glanced at his clock. It was 2:00 in the morning. He was probably exhausted. "Thank you for your help," I said, wishing I could have given him more. I watched him hobble down the cluttered hallway, dodging piles of crap that needed to be thrown away. He hadn't even said goodnight to the fish man from the market. He left both lamps on the scuffed-up end tables on for us. When I turned back to my savior to see if he was offended by this, he was holding what was left of the water and a bottle of pills 2 inches from my face. "This will help ease the pain so you can sleep tonight," he explained. "It's mild over-the-counter stuff, but you'll need it to take a little of the edge off. Take them now." I obeyed, unsure how to communicate with this strange man. "Thank you. How did you know where I was?" "You were screaming," he stated, cleaning up the rags and discarded trash around the table. Some of the trash was ours and some wasn't. He wiped my blood off his hands with an old rag as if it were no big deal. "Why were you out there?" I prodded. Most people weren't brave enough to go into the woods in Midnight Springs. We had heard stories about witches and magic passed down through generations, and some still believed it. I wasn't one of those crazy people, but I was still wary. They had to be afraid for some reason, magical or not. He shrugged. "Why were you out there?" "Jeff and I were camping," I said, defending myself instead of pushing him to answer my question first. "Camping? Without a tent?" he asked. "There was a tent," I argued. "You didn't see it because it wasn't close to where I fell. I walked far away so he couldn't hear me pee." He chuckled. I had never heard him chuckle before, and by the look on his face, it was new to him too. "Can you walk?" he asked, standing abruptly. "I'll take you back there." "I could have walked here," I argued. "You're the one who insisted on carrying me like a damsel in distress." He shook his head as he opened the door for me. His long black hair swung from side to side, giving me glimpses of the smile he was wearing. As he stood there shirtless, I found it hard not to admire his body. He looked so strong, but not in the vain way that boys do to look bigger. Those muscles were functional. I felt it when he effortlessly carried me and held me close to him. We walked back toward the tree line into the warm night. Within moments, I missed the cool air conditioning of the old man's house. August in Arkansas was too freaking hot. "What was his name?" I asked, following close behind him as he crossed over from the overgrown yard to the absolute wildness of the woods. "Who?" "The old man," I said. I pointed back to the house even though he wasn't looking at me. "Oh, Mr. Atkins," he said. He offered nothing else. I figured he was content to walk me back to our camp in silence, but I wasn't. "Okay. Well, what's your name?" I asked. He stopped, like he was thinking about it. I wondered if he was actually going to answer me or not. "Peter," he said, and his brisk pace continued. He moved with such deftness through the wild growth as if he already knew where every branch was before we got to it. I struggled to keep my balance as I tried to mimic his steps. Briars scratched my legs and made me wish for the 1,000th time that I had never decided to go camping with Jeff, or I would have at least worn pants. "Wait!" I cried out, stopping to catch my breath. My muscles burned, screaming at me about how out of shape I was. I rested my good hand on a nearby tree and got something sticky on it. I quickly wiped it on my shorts, desperate to get out of nature. He turned around and closed the distance between us with such minimal effort that it angered me. "What's wrong?" "You're going too fast," I complained. "My legs aren't as long as yours. Slow down a little bit." He looked down at my leg and pointed to my arm hanging by my side. "What is this?" I looked down, unsure of what he meant. Was he insane? He was pointing to the arm he had just stitched up. If anyone knew what it was, it should have been him. He grabbed my hand and gently pulled my arm up to my chest, careful not to touch my chest himself. "You have to keep it up," he explained. He sounded like he was getting on to me like I was a child. "You didn't tell me that," I argued through my ragged breaths. "I shouldn't have to tell you that." His exasperation was palpable. "You can't get mad at me for not doing something you never told me to do. I can't read your mind," I demanded. "You shouldn't have to read my mind. Everyone knows you elevate injuries." I huffed, but the throbbing in my arm was already starting to subside. I was angry, but he was right. At my silence, he turned and started leading the way again. This time, however, he did it slower and glanced back frequently. I wasn't sure if he was checking to see if I was keeping up, or if he was making sure I was listening to him about keeping my arm up. "This is where you fell," he said, coming to an abrupt stop. I held out my good hand to brace myself on his back and keep from running into him. His back was sweaty from the heat, but not so much that my hand slipped. It was sweaty enough to make my hand want to stick to him as I slowly pulled it back. Or maybe it was the sticky tree stuff. I hoped he wouldn't mind if I'd gotten it all over him. I looked around, anxious about either one of us stepping in my pee, and I saw it. "There's that stupid demonic tree that attacked me," I said, pointing to the root that tripped me and the branch that stabbed me. He chuckled. "Trees can be evil sometimes. You have to watch out for them. Which way is your tent from here?" "It was that way," I said, pointing to our right. I was nervous about spending the night in the woods by myself, but I didn't want to walk all the way back to town either. I needed sleep. Sleep, then shower. Sleep, then shower. That was my mantra. "I don't see it," Peter said. "Are you sure it's this way?" "Yes, I'm sure," I confirmed. But I wasn't. I could very well have been taking us farther into the woods to our deaths. "Do you think he would have taken it down when he left?" he asked, scanning the dark forest floor for a tent that wasn't there. I groaned, my shoulders slumping. I hadn't even thought of that. I needed to sleep so badly. My adrenaline was wearing off, and I didn't know if I could even make it to town without falling over. I needed rest. I also looked at the forest floor, wondering how dangerous it would be to sleep out in the open for the night. At the very least, I would wake up with 1,000,000 mosquito bites. Then, ringing out louder than the obnoxious bugs surrounding us, I heard her. Peter must have heard her too, because he stopped walking and craned his ear in the same direction the sound came from. It was Holly, and she sounded happy. The squeals and giggles she was making weren't the sounds of someone getting their heart broken. They were the sounds of someone reuniting with their loved one. I couldn't understand her words, but her tone was so upbeat. Was she telling Jeff all about her summer on a movie set in LA and how glamorous it was? What would he say about his summer when it was his turn? Would he tell true stories but omit me from them? Or would he fabricate an entire lie about how he spent his time? The worst thing was that he had brought her to our tent, where we had... I closed my eyes to shut out reality, but when I did, all I saw behind them was Jeff as he hovered over me, our bodies sweaty from the August night and the stupid, stupid decision I had made. All of the bull he fed me echoed through the night, mixed with the sounds of her laughter. Of course Holly would get the happy ending. Her father was a famous actor, and she had more money than she knew what to do with. She would never have to worry about where her next meal was coming from or living on the streets. How could I ever expect Jeff to actually choose me over her once she got back from the West Coast? I had $300 to my name, and she was probably wearing a shirt worth that much. Or maybe not, if Jeff was looking to repeat our experience earlier with her. He may have already relieved her of her expensive clothes. Hands lightly touched my shoulders, and I opened my eyes to see Peter in front of me. He knelt down so that he was eye level with me. His look of concern made my anger melt to sadness. "Do you have a place to stay tonight?" he whispered. I sighed, my shoulders sagging beneath my hands. He kept them on me, though, and he kept his eyes on mine. "My apartment is in town," I whispered. He nodded, no doubt knowing how far it was to Midnight Springs from here, especially on foot. "You can stay with me." He started back in the opposite direction. I followed, anxious to get farther away from Holly and her happiness. Her giggles quietened, and I wondered if it was because of the distance between us or if she was occupied doing other things. The forest floor got thicker as we traveled deeper in. I thought Jeff was insane for going as deep as we did, but Peter was even more so. I had never heard of anyone brave enough to come this far in the woods. His pace slowed as we came upon his campsite. As if it had been dropped from the sky, a banged-up vintage camper trailer sat in the middle of the forest. There was no road someone could have pulled it in on. The tire on the side facing me was flat, and it was surrounded by nature on all sides. It had been there for a while. It was made of what looked like old rusty metal, and the side was shaped like an oval. It looked like it belonged in a scrapyard. He opened the door and entered without explanation, expecting me to follow him. Was my brain stuck in some kind of deranged gear where I only made idiotic decisions? I couldn't follow this guy into that creepy old camper. I was going to get murdered. Millie was going to be all alone. "Hurry and shut the door so the bugs don't get in," he said calmly, oblivious to my mental battle. A soft light came from within, and like a moth, I drew closer to it and shut the door behind me. Peter set a lantern on the counter by the sink, illuminating the small space. It was as old and dirty as I expected, but nothing screamed serial killer. It was slightly stuffier than the outside air, but the small open windows let in a light breeze for us. "Get some rest," he said, pointing to the bed. I squeezed around him and climbed onto the bed, surprised to find sheets, blankets, and a pillow. He grabbed one of the blankets off the foot of the bed and cleared a place for himself on the floor with his foot. Laying the blanket down as a pallet, he settled in with his head close to me. His feet nearly touched the end of the camper. While I had some room to stretch out, there was no way he could sleep in the bed comfortably with his long legs. "Peter, rest Brooke," he ordered. There would obviously be no pillow talk. "You don't have to keep the lantern on," I whispered, feeling guilty for taking anything from a guy who had so little. I didn't know how much oil it would take to be lit for the rest of the night. "I don't want you to wake up in the dark scared and forget where you are," he mumbled. I smiled and stayed quiet, letting him go to sleep. There was no way I could sleep. My mind was racing in a million different directions. My arm hurt so much, I was regretting not going to the hospital. They would have numbed it before stitching it. They would have used real stitches. But if I had gone, they would have wanted to call my mom. My heart was broken into a million pieces. I had given Jeff every piece of me. He had my heart, body, and soul. And I didn't have his. I never did. I was sleeping in the middle of the forest with Peter, a guy who had let me take a scaleless fish for free and sleep in his bed, a guy who had carried me and stitched up my arm. He had wrapped up my wound with his own shirt. I gasped. Did he have another shirt? I leaned up and looked down at him. In the lantern glow, I could see his scruffy face relaxed in sleep. His dark hair and dark beard made his skin look even lighter. His jaw was slacked and soft sounds came from his mouth as he breathed. His bare chest, which he hopefully had another shirt to cover, was rising and falling with each breath. I sat up all the way to get a better look at my surroundings, but there wasn't much to see. Jugs of water lined the wall where a stove should have been. Random tools were piled on countertops. An old pink shower caddy was filled with toiletries. Peter lived here. Peter was homeless. I had stolen a fish from a homeless man. I cried myself to sleep. My body shook violently as I tried to keep the noise down so I wouldn't wake him. If I didn't find a way to make money, Millie and I would end up just like him. Or worse.